Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Hello. Today we're going to discuss the 3 murders and many attempted murders committed by Axel Rudakubana in Southport in July 2024. Or rather, the findings of a public inquiry into why these terrible crimes happened and whether they could have been prevented. The chair of the inquiry, Sir Adrian Fulford, is a former High Court judge. With Rob Allen and I to discuss these findings are Professor Lynn Davies of ConnectFutures CIC, and Selina Wallis, who manages the involvement of patients, the public and the community in applied health research. Rob, what were your first impressions from reading this inquiry report?
Well, I think an immense sadness, really, and horror at what happened on that day in Southport. 3 little girls losing their lives, several more really badly injured, many more traumatised, still living with the consequences that they'll live with forever. The scale of the harm that was perpetrated on that day, I don't think I'd quite appreciated how awful it was.
I didn't appreciate it either. There were so many more victims than the 3 girls who tragically died. It was a very, very, very bad day indeed, and one where the victims and their families are clearly still very much living with the consequences of it. In terms of the report's findings on why the tragedy happened, any first impressions there?
Well, with these sorts of inquiries, investigations, hindsight is something that creeps in, and perhaps it's easy to say that there were lots of warning signs, but my feeling was there were a very great number of warnings in advance in this young man's life. Signs that he was dangerous and high risk, and they weren't picked up. Lots of agencies were involved, but very little, it seemed to me, was actually done to try and work with him and his family to change the course of his life. Sir Adrian does say that certain things that were done or not done, if they'd been done differently, they would have prevented it or were very likely to have prevented it. So it is a real wake-up call to the system that we have developed in this country for dealing with children, safeguarding children, protecting against children who are a risk to others.
Selina, your first impressions?
What really stood out for me is what I feel isn't in the report. So there's no sense of the family life in the home. There's no sense of the inner world of Axel and what he understood. You know, there's little signs that you can get, but it's so procedural. I mean, there's pages and pages of records of meetings, but very little of, you know, what was understood by them and what people were going to do about the things that they heard. And I think that felt very difficult for me reading it.
I agree. You read a lot of Axel's quotes and violence, but beyond that, you don't really have a picture of what he was like as a boy. Lynn, what were your first impressions?
I'm coming at this also because I was called as an expert witness for the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry. So always in my head is the comparison between Salman Abedi and Axel Rudakubana in terms of their history.
Remind us who Salman was.
Salman Abedi was the bomber who killed 22 people at the Manchester Arena Ariana Grande concert and thousands injured. And I looked at 360 documents from Salman Abedi, the bomber's educational history and family, in terms of whether the schools should have realised what was going on. So always I'm thinking of that in terms of Axel Rudakubana's educational history and who should have known and who should have intervened. And we know from the report, actually, there was a lot more intervention and a lot more going on there than there ever was with Salman Abedi, which is interesting.
There was tons and tons going on over those teenage years. There were so many agencies involved, so many referrals.
Yeah, and none of it was joined up. Everybody had the fragments of that. And as Selina says, we don't get a picture of whether anybody was putting those fragments together. We can't find an ownership of Axel anywhere, any of this. All the agencies are doing what they're supposed to do. And then it doesn't work.
I run a research development network where we have families with lived experience of very similar incidents in their children's lives, as you see in the report. And when children are in that kind of situation, whether it's a permanent exclusion, whether it's carrying a knife, whether it's being referred to prevent.
All of which happened to Axel, didn't they?
All of which happened to Axel. A family can be desperate for help and have multiple professionals involved with them, and yet no one actually able to offer an intervention that can support that family or support that child. And I know bullying has gone on. You know, in the report they talk about bullying, but I don't think the adults are seeing the reality of what it's like to be an adolescent in a school. And bullying to adults doesn't necessarily look the same as it does to the reality, the lived reality of an adolescent in a school setting.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Adrian Fulford seems to not actually believe at all that Axel was bullied, whereas Axel said he was bullied, and actually bullying is often very hidden from adults. So, Lynn, I was a bit perplexed that Sir Adrian absolutely didn't believe Axel about that.
I find that extraordinary because he was sort of seeing it as a factual thing. He was either bullied or he wasn't bullied. And bullying is a factual thing, but it's also highly, highly subjective. And Fulford doesn't really comprehend, I think, what it might be like for somebody who's maybe struggling. So I think he shouldn't be saying whether or not he was bullied. If Axel thought he was being bullied and acted on those grounds and took offence and so on, then you have to go with that. You say, well, that was how it was. That's how he saw it. And that explains his behaviour.
As said in the report, Axel's experience of going to secondary school in year 7, he was shown not to be getting into trouble. He was a good pupil. He had good attendance. He had a few friends. But as it moved into year 8, he started to have problems, and the parents were requesting mental health support for him. And then he started saying things towards the end of year 8. He started saying things in the class that worried the teachers and probably the other children, justifying terrorism in different situations and sort of talking about violence and things related to the internet and news stories.
Of course, I picked out the thing for him saying that the Manchester Arena was a good battle, that, you know, he was already finding things that were interesting to him and struck chords with him in terms of what you could get into. And increase of his browsing history was showing constant, starting to show, looking at violence.
But I also got a sense from reading the reports that this was, a relatively intelligent person who was interested in history. His parents came from a background of the Rwandan massacres. So he will have been trying to understand justice, trying to understand why human beings might behave in this way. So he had wide-ranging interests that were brought up in the report about all sorts of different things, not just about terrorism, but about religion and about sort of politics and history. So, it may have been that this started out as somebody trying to understand the world, but actually because of all the things that happened later on, that became the grievance, that became the reason why he decided to behave in the way that he did.
Yeah, so Selina, it seems pretty clear that he was looking at stuff on the internet that ended up having a really negative effect on his mindset and his behaviour. Do we know what he was accessing?
A lot of the things that he was looking at weren't even necessarily things that were like on the dark web or anything like that. They were news stories. You can look at horrific things based just on looking at the news stories. And a child that is hyper-focused on trying to look at like terrorism and world politics, there's just, constant stuff going on that you could look at. We know that he started accessing things in school because it was the school that was being able to understand that he was looking at violent imagery or videos. But he also had access to several devices at home, and they were removed at one point from him and sort of monitored, but they didn't find what they were looking for. The only real way to stop children from looking at things from the internet is to have no devices in the home. And that means adult devices as well as child devices, because children will get on other devices at night.
So you mean it's technically very difficult, even if parents wanted to restrict what their child was seeing, technically it's impossible, you're saying, to do that?
Pretty much, yes. Yes. In the group that I run, we've got a parent whose child was referred to Prevent, which is the counter-terrorism programme of the UK. And they were accepted onto the Channel programme, which is a voluntary programme to try and prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. And even in that situation, they were having problems with the child accessing inappropriate things at home. And even with counter-terrorism involved, they asked for tech help and they had no ability to provide that to the family. And they also weren't able to give advice to the family on how to do that themselves, other than they should be doing it.
Which is why you have to tackle it from the point of view of the person and the child and the student looking at all this stuff, which is sort of work we do in ConnectFutures, which is all the workshops on misinformation, disinformation, for fake news, hate news, all of that. At least to try to sow the seeds of kids not believing everything they see and not getting sucked into the glorification of violence.
But as far as we know, none of this sort of work was done in Axel's case. He was given a pretty free rein to visit all sorts of very damaging websites, and for long periods of time. I get the impression that in the period, the 18 months before July 2024, he was effectively not going out much and just looking at this stuff, consuming all this awful stuff hour after hour, day and night. Is that your impression, Selina?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that he was basically left without any meaningful relationship with any other human being. He wasn't in relationship with his family. He wasn't responding to or talking to members of his family. He wasn't leaving the house. So he had no human relationships to counter anything. All he was doing was being hyper-focused on violence and grievance for, nearly 2 years. I think it would drive anyone to madness being in that situation, to be honest.
I'd just like to touch on the parents in this situation because, it is clear that for about a year and a half, he was in his room all day, most of the time, looking at terrible, violent websites. Did the parents, do you get the impression, Lynn, try and do anything about it?
We don't know, I think, what they were doing at that point. They had asked for help with Axel earlier on. They weren't completely averse to trying to look for support. They obviously were worried about him. I get the impression of a sort of paralysis around this. They were frightened of him because he was obviously violent. They were not aware of any support mechanisms they could ask for that wouldn't involve social services coming in, taking Axel away, taking away the brother as well. So their view, I think, of trying to ask for help would be a very negative one. Why would they admit to anything, even if they were worried? Because the consequences were that they would lose their children. And I think that's true of many parents who would want to be supported. And they wouldn't have felt that there were really close support mechanisms for them that would work with them rather than against them.
But they didn't even seem to put parental controls on anything.
No.
Well, I mean, to be fair to them, most parental controls in the UK tend to be turned off by the company when the child is 13, so it wouldn't have covered him anyway. You need, specialist technical support.
I mean, the law on children's access to the internet has changed, I think we should say, since 2024, the Online Safety Act. I mean, would he be able to see the same sort of horrific stuff on the internet today?
You could easily get it. The Online Safety Act is just looking at age verification on certain websites. There's millions of other websites that they can access that aren't going to use those methods, so it makes no difference.
Lynn, the report is pretty critical of Axel's parents, particularly his father, Alphonse, for many things, but including this, as Sir Adrian Caesar inability to curb Axel's internet use. Do you think the criticism of the parents is fair?
I'm slightly uneasy about the whole notion of blaming the parents, and it's, if only the parents had acted differently, it would have been different. I'm not sure. One has a picture of parents who feel unable to do it. It's not a deliberate hiding of things. The report keeps accusing the father of lying. Well, if you're being defensive about your actions, of course you're going to lie. We all do it. And I don't think it helps to paint this picture of parents who were devious. It was an incredibly difficult home background with an incredibly difficult child. I don't know how I would cope as a parent if I had Axel in the home. I don't know what I would do. Do you try and protect him? Do you try and, just mitigate it a bit? Do you just shop him to the authorities and say, I can't cope? They decided not to do that. And I can see why not. Many parents would be in the same position.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. If you read the report and you look at the lives of that family, that was a horrific situation for all of them. It wasn't a normal family life in any sense of the word. Those parents were already probably experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder from their earlier life experiences, especially the mother. You can hear in the report, she was dissociated a lot of the time, which meant that she wasn't able to parent her child in that situation because it triggered immense fear in her, the way that he was behaving. But also, as a parent, I'm sure that they did not expect that he would do this. Yes, they were scared of him, and they knew he was, ordering these weapons and things like that. But I'm sure that they didn't believe that he was going to go and actually do something like this. They were shocked because he hadn't grown up like this. He hadn't been a child that was dangerous. And, the systems didn't put the help in that they should have done.
But don't you think there were occasions where the father seemed really actively to mislead the authorities about the level of harm and danger that Axel presented in terms of going to school with knives on 10 occasions, threatening to kill people, all this? Didn't he make light of that? I think that's what Sir Adrian Fulford found difficult to comprehend, really, that a father would do that.
Yeah, so if you look at the timeline of what happened to him, he had phoned Childline when he was in school to say that he'd been carrying knives in school and that he wanted to stab somebody because of this feeling that he had been bullied. And, I see that as a cry for help, that he did actually phone Childline. At that point, he was permanently excluded from school straight away. And that's a massive shock for parents. Obviously, as far as I know, they weren't aware that any of that had happened before that. So already you've got to take into account that your child's both been carrying a knife, has threatened somebody, and was permanently excluded from school. He went back to the school where he'd been excluded from and tried to attack the child with, a hockey stick that he felt had been bullying him. And then he started to have weapons sent to his home, which his family did intercept, a few times. And then finally, on the day of the murder, he hadn't been leaving the house. And so it was unusual for him to leave the house, and he left the house, and the family didn't inform the police that he'd left the house. So, I think that was very unfortunate that they didn't do that. But I think at that point they were living in a situation that no one could comprehend.
I think what really struck me, though, from reading the report is that the reason why the parents got to the situation they did was that Axel was very violent to them. He attacked them physically, but he also would be very violent with objects within the home, throw things around, smash things up, and so on. So it wouldn't be surprising if they were afraid of him. Do you think they were afraid of him?
Definitely, yeah. And they were probably blaming themselves somewhat for saying, we've raised this child who's like this, it's our responsibility. I don't know. But they wouldn't have comprehended simply going out of the house that he would go and commit this,
The parents did have some kind of family therapy intervention, presumably designed to improve the extent to which they could control him. But clearly that didn't work. I mean, should they have had more help? Who should have done it, and what would it have been?
Well, there can be interventions, but they can be short-lived and they're not necessarily followed through. There's so much in all of the agencies and the work that they do that is short-term. So you are referred to the Prevent scheme and you're referred to Channel. You have 6 weeks of mentoring. then what? Are you supposed to be saying, all right, I'm not at risk of radicalisation anymore, I'm fine? One of the problems with PREVENT is it was drawn up very much to deal with Islamist terrorism. It then obviously expanded much more to deal with far right, and now what is called mixed, unclear or unstable ideologies, or, as in Axel's case, not even comprehensible ideologies. We're not even sure he had an ideology.
So do you think he should have been accepted on?
Yeah. Well, he was referred to PREVENT 3 times by the school. And one of the issues was that nobody knows now what happened to those referrals, whether he was given any intervention, whether he was given any advice, whether it had gone any further. We are assuming not. We're assuming that PREVENT looked at it and said it's not something that we deal with, and therefore nothing happened. And the school would have wanted to refer him for a 4th time, but because they hadn't heard about anything that had happened with regard to the 3 previous referrals, they thought, why are we doing this?
If he had been accepted onto PREVENT, like Lynn said, he might have received, some mentoring or something like that. So the PREVENT programme would find an independent provider who has some relation to the kind of terrorism that maybe you've been talking about. So it might be somebody with experience of the far right, or if it's something to do with religion, they might find an imam or something like that could speak to you. Because in the old-fashioned way, radicalisation would have happened by an organisation or an individual trying to convince someone else to maybe, carry out acts of terrorism. But the way that the internet works for children now, people can be radicalised not by an individual, but just by the algorithm. So in that way, PREVENT doesn't necessarily prevent what it's trying to prevent. For me, the thing that's missing in the report and from all the interventions with Axel was he didn't build up a relationship. It wasn't about relationships and human belonging. It was all about education interventions and things like that. But what he needed, and it was brought up in the referral from the Acorn School, that he needs intensive therapeutic relationship building. But they knocked that back and said that, he could be provided some kind of intervention by like a local charity or something like that. And that's very common with children with autism. Parents of children with autism, maybe not with this kind of violence fixation, but other kinds of issues that children might have. They ask for help because they can see that their child is struggling with their mental health. But if it's autism related, they tend to get knocked back, and they, CAMS will say, oh, this is autism related. This isn't strictly mental health. So parents and children find themselves in this big gap where there's no support at all. And, they just have to muddle on and look for things on the internet to help, which, doesn't really do much good.
Lynn, children like Axel are now referred to as violence fixated, which is a bit of a jargon term, frankly, but we know what it means. Do you think it would make sense to broaden the remit of PREVENT so that it included children like Axel, who definitely were fixated by violence, but really didn't seem to have any clear ideology?
I think so. It's already his remit says mixed, unclear and unstable. And so the unclear one would enable you to take on board violence fixated individuals because it's unclear what their motives are for being at risk of, creating some sort of act. Either that or you create another new hub or mechanism by which you then identify kids who are at risk. The problem, of course, with all of that is the notion of whether it's extreme. The normalisation of violence on the web and everywhere else is so huge now that violence is now normalised. This is what kids do. And it's going to be really difficult to actually identify somebody who gets beyond those boundaries.
I mean, one thing he was diagnosed with after a long period of time was autism. We've referred to this autism spectrum disorder. I mean, it took a long time to get that diagnosis. I mean, Selina, do you think his autism to an extent explains his behaviour? How's it linked?
I think autism plays a part. Children with autism, they can have what you call a hyperfocus, so they can show a lot of interest in a topic, and they can struggle with social relationships. So, all of those things combined with the lack of support and the lack of intervention, I think earlier diagnosis of autism might have helped. And also I think in the report, They talk about that he had an ADHD referral. He was knocked back because the school report felt that it was behaviour rather than signs of ADHD. But, I would argue that maybe wasn't their place to decide that. To me, it would have made sense to take it to a clinician. There is evidence that the medication that you are given for ADHD can reduce in the population level criminal acts, violent acts. So, if he did have undiagnosed ADHD, there are things that could have been put in place. He would have also been seen regularly by a paediatrician, and that would have meant other people had eyes on him, other people had an understanding of his thought processes that could have maybe helped get better interventions in place.
Yeah, this has worried me slightly about the report, that it seems to say that neurodivergence is in itself a problem, and that autism is something that you suffer from rather than a condition which can be actually very useful, very important, and not necessarily negative. And so there's a lot of problems, I think, around the sort of labelling of that. And if people interpret the report of saying, he was autistic, therefore he was going to be a problem. And I don't think the report was nuanced enough about that. I don't know what you think, Selina.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I am totally with you. There's been plenty of research to show that children or people with autism don't have a higher propensity towards violence, as anyone else in the population. But there are certain aspects of neurodiversity that can make life more difficult.
Yeah.
The thing that I would like to really bring in is that belonging is so important to children, a sense of belonging not only to, a family, a sense of belonging in a school, but a sense of belonging to the human race, and I think that children can lose that sense of belonging. And that was a sense that I got, that Axel lost his sense of belonging, and he needed adults to bring him back so that he valued other people's lives. And that's what I would have liked to have seen.
Yeah, because we have no idea. I didn't get a picture of Axel as having a sense of belonging, even to friends and the local community or anything. I mean, as you said, it was very much the lone wolf thing, which is a different scenario altogether in terms of whether it's prevent or whatever interventions you're going to make.
Yeah. Moving to what the bulk of the report is about, which is the agencies, the organisations and their contacts with Axel over the years. The police had quite a lot to do with him, quite serious crimes. He obviously was prosecuted for one crime, which was attacking a pupil at a school with a hockey stick. There was another occasion when he was found with a knife on a bus, and the police decided not to take any action. They took him home. And as a result of this, he didn't have very much contact with the youth justice services in Lancashire. He did get one order, a so-called referral order, but a fairly light intervention. And I think Fulford thinks that it would have been better had he had more intrusive, as he puts it, interventions from youth justice. What do you think? Would that have helped?
Yes, it is unfortunate that he didn't have more youth justice involvement, but the reason maybe is different than what people would think, because the Youth Justice Service is able to provide a much more intense service than many of the other offers that families have. So the Youth Justice will provide a relationship building exercise, possibly like weekly contact over an entire year potentially. And that would have allowed Axel to build up a closer relationship. And I think there is in the reports evidence that when he was under the referral order, unfortunately, it was also the time of COVID, and that changed the way that professionals were working. And I think that had an effect. I mean, youth justice isn't in some ways the ideal situation, because if you read the reports, Axel had built up a sense of potentially being seen as a bad person, and if you're under youth justice, children can start to think of themselves as a bad person, a dangerous person. So sometimes that can backfire. But, if it wasn't youth justice, it needed somebody working in that way, in a trauma-informed, relationship-building way, to actually get to the heart of what is actually going on for this person and how can we help them.
And I think you're quite right. And it's the trauma-informed bit rather than seeing somebody as criminal. And sort of intervening in the pre-criminal space.
Axel and his parents had multiple contacts with multiple agencies, and it's clear that his parents were absolutely struggling to cope. And what is interesting is that he didn't get anywhere near the threshold of them thinking about taking him into care. He wasn't even high on the child protection register. It just never seemed to occur to them that this was a child who really needed absolutely intensive intervention from children's services, whether it be youth justice services within children's services or the welfare services.
Yeah. The thing with Axel is right from the very first time where he phoned Childline before he was permanently excluded, he was talking not only about carrying knives, but he was talking about wanting to harm people. And I think that really, really should have been a sign that he was already in a very bad place. So intervention should have been in place before all that happened.
Yeah, yeah. And the school was furious, weren't they, that nothing happened, and they did report it and they knew this was going on.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the Fulford report recommendations is that children's services should take more account of risk to others rather than this very narrow safeguarding focus on risk to the child themselves.
Yes.
I mean, generally, he's pretty frustrated in the report that no one agency, no one individual was responsible for managing the growing risk that he sees in Axel's behaviour. I mean, do you share the frustration, Lynn?
I do. And I think it is a problem of this isolation of agencies, that there is often insufficient connection between all the agencies in terms of reporting, that schools don't know what the other agencies are doing, they don't get feedback. I think there should be a lot more sharing of data. I know there's huge problems of confidentiality and huge problems of labelling of children, but I think situations such as this show that, there must be, with safeguards, much, much more sharing of data between the agencies and the schools, between the agencies and, say, youth justice, in terms of what they're doing, what the next steps are supposed to be, who's in charge of it, who in the end owned Axel. And no one agency or no one person could see all of these pieces of the jigsaw and all of the interventions and the referrals that had been made. And I think that's a problem of the British system, and other systems, European ones, are sometimes a bit more joined up. But we don't have that.
Yeah, Selina, what do you think?
I think, there are situations where you should have all the agencies meeting regularly to discuss the child and what's happened with interventions. But yeah, in the reports, it seems like, that really wasn't happening. But also part of the problem is, you could create another agency that would hold everything. But if it's just data that they're holding, there's still no relationship. The thing that was missing was the relationship. The thing that was missing is trust and trauma-informed work with the parents and the child. And there just isn't. What agency would have provided that? If you have an agency just saying, oh, yes, well, this is all the information, but no one's actually doing anything with that information and in a way that is making a difference, then it's not going to change anything.
Yeah. Well, I think Fulford is due to produce a further report, a phase 2, which is, among other things, looking at this question of whether there's a need for a new agency. Maybe we will need to have a phase 2 of this podcast when that one comes out, but we have to draw this one to a close, sadly. We end by asking each of you, what one thing do you wish could have been done in Axel's case that might have prevented the tragedy happening in July 2024? Lynn?
I would like to see a structured network of connectivity between all the people, the organisations that are working with someone like Axel around violence reduction, to share information and data and knowledge and the work that they're doing, and a duty to report, not just internally in the reviews, but to report to each other, to share data and to say what's happening with this one.
Okay, thanks. Selina?
I'd like to see an organisation that works with violence fixated young people, that creates a sense of belonging and understanding between the child and the family, that works in a therapeutic way and also has access to tech experts that can help parents lock down social media to prevent them getting fixated on violence. Okay,
thanks. Penelope, what about you?
I would like better understanding and research about approaches to this child-to-parent violence. It's a growing problem. In Axel's case, it was really important that the parents were fearful of their child. And I don't actually think the expertise is there on quite how to deal with it. What about you, Rob?
I would like to see better record keeping. Fulford is critical that some of the records that people kept were very inaccurate, and there needs to be, if you're going to have these different agencies, and we will, whatever new one there is, people are going to need to talk to each other about particular cases. They need to have very good, detailed notes of contacts with these people.
Thanks, Rob, for that. I agree. And thanks, Lynn and Selina, too. And if you'd like to know more about our great guests and about the inquiry itself, do refer to our programme notes. Till next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.